Frank the Bull. Torino never imagined his Tuesday morning intimidation run would end with armored vehicles surrounding Sal's Corner Deli, when he decided to teach an 81-year-old veteran a lesson about respect. He unknowingly triggered a response that would demonstrate the true meaning of leave no man behind. At 81, Staff Sergeant Robert Bobby Martinez still carried himself with the quiet dignity of a career soldier. His weathered hands bore the scars of 2 tours in Afghanistan, while his eyes held the patient wisdom of a man who'd seen humanity at its worst and best, never losing faith in either. What began as a routine collection for the Torino crime family would soon become a masterclass in military precision, family loyalty, and the consequences of disrespecting those who've served. The gangster's moment of cruelty would collide with a lifetime of honor, duty, and unbreakable bonds forged in combat. This is a story about what happens when a neighborhood enforcer mistakes an elderly veteran's peaceful demeanor for weakness, and how 22 minutes later, that mistake would bring the full weight of military justice to a quiet Brooklyn deli. It's about the bonds that connect all who have served, the values that define true strength, and the swift consequences that await those who dare to assault America's heroes. Frank thought he was collecting protection money from helpless civilians. Bobby knew he was about to receive backup from the most powerful military in the world. Neither man could predict how quickly respect would be restored and justice would be served in the most overwhelming way possible. Before we dive into this incredible story of justice and military brotherhood, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss stories like this where justice is served in the most unexpected ways. And let me know in the comments, what would you do if you witnessed something like this happening? Sal's Corner Deli occupied a busy intersection in the heart of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, where old-school Italian-American traditions met the changing demographics of modern New York. The family-owned establishment had served the community for 35 years, its red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floor witnessing countless conversations, celebrations, and quiet moments of neighborhood life. The deli's walls told the story of a community that valued tradition and respect. Faded photographs of local high school football teams hung alongside pictures of neighborhood block parties, communion celebrations, and wedding receptions held in the small back room. A special corner displayed portraits of local heroes who had served in various conflicts, from World War II veterans who had helped build the neighborhood to younger faces who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Tuesday mornings at Sal's followed a predictable rhythm that had remained unchanged for decades. Coffee began brewing at 5:30 a.m. sharp, filling the deli with a rich aroma that would draw the first customers by 6. The regulars claimed their usual spots by 7. Construction workers grabbing quick breakfasts before heading to job sites, retired men gathering to discuss politics and sports, and neighborhood mothers stopping by after dropping their children at school. The atmosphere typically radiated warmth and familiarity, where disputes were settled with heated but respectful arguments, and everyone from the parish priest to the local beat cop was treated like family. It was the kind of place where your coffee cup was refilled without asking, where Sal remembered how you liked your sandwich after just 2 visits, and where being rude to an elder would earn you a lecture from half the customers. But beneath this peaceful veneer, the neighborhood carried the weight of a darker reality. The Castellano crime family had maintained a presence in Bensonhurst for generations, collecting protection money from local businesses through a carefully orchestrated system of intimidation and implied violence. Most shop owners paid quietly, viewing it as an unfortunate cost of doing business in their beloved neighborhood. Staff Sergeant Robert Bobby Martinez had enlisted in the United States Army at 19, driven by a profound sense of duty instilled by his immigrant parents who believed that America deserved their family's ultimate service. His father, Carlos, had fled poverty in Puerto Rico to build a better life in New York, working double shifts in a textile factory, while his mother, Rosa, cleaned office buildings at night to help make ends meet. Growing up in a small apartment 3 blocks from Sal's Deli, Bobby had learned the values of hard work, respect for others, and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves. When the Twin Towers fell during his senior year of high school, those values crystallized into an unshakable conviction that he needed to serve his country in its darkest hour. 2 tours in Afghanistan had tested every aspect of Bobby's character, from the unforgiving mountains of Kandahar province to the complex urban warfare of Kabul. He had earned his stripes the hard way, leading men through impossible situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between bringing everyone home or writing letters to grieving families. The Purple Heart on his bedroom dresser told only part of the story. It represented the roadside bomb outside Bagram that had left shrapnel in his left leg and taken the life of his best friend, Corporal James Jimmy O'Sullivan from Boston. The Bronze Star represented something deeper. The night he had single-handedly held off a Taliban assault on a remote outpost, buying time for a medical helicopter to evacuate 3 wounded soldiers. But the medals and commendations couldn't capture what those years had really cost him. The nightmares that still visited him 3 decades later. The hypervigilance that made him unconsciously catalog every exit in every room he entered. The weight of command decisions that had saved some lives while ending others. The brotherhood forged in combat that made every veteran a member of his extended family, regardless of when or where they had served. After his military service, Bobby had returned to Brooklyn, married his high school sweetheart Maria Gonzalez, and raised 2 children while working construction for a union contractor. He had never spoken much about the war, preferring to let his actions define his character rather than relying on old stories of heroism. The community knew him as a reliable neighbor who would help anyone in need, a devoted husband who walked his wife to church every Sunday, and a man whose handshake was his bond. His son, Captain Diego Martinez, had followed him into military service, but had chosen a different path than his father's infantry background. Diego had excelled in special operations and intelligence, rising through the ranks with a kind of rapid advancement that came from exceptional performance under pressure. Currently stationed at Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn, Diego served as a liaison between military intelligence units and federal law enforcement agencies operating in the New York area. The pride Bobby felt in his son's achievements was matched only by his concern for the unique burdens of modern military leadership. Their weekly phone calls had become a treasured ritual, conversations that blended fatherly advice with professional respect between 2 soldiers who understood the weight of command and the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. Frank Torino represented everything Bobby Martinez had spent his adult life opposing. The belief that fear and violence could substitute for respect and honor, that physical intimidation was a legitimate way to solve problems, and that some people were simply entitled to take what they wanted from those weaker than themselves. At 38 years old and carrying 280 pounds on his 6 feet 4 inches frame, Frank had built his reputation as a mid-level enforcer for the Castellano crime family through a carefully cultivated image of barely controlled violence. His nickname, the Bull, came not just from his size, but from his preferred method of operation, charging through problems with overwhelming physical presence rather than finesse or intelligence. Frank had grown up in the same neighborhood as Bobby, but their paths couldn't have been more different. Where Bobby's parents had instilled values of service and sacrifice, Frank had learned from his father, Big Tony Torino, that the world was divided into predators and prey, and that the smart money was on being a predator. Big Tony had been a numbers runner for the Castellano family in the 1980s, working his way up through minor extortion and loan sharking until he controlled several blocks of protection rackets. Frank had started working for his father at 16, collecting money from shop owners who were behind on their payments, and learning that most people would hand over cash rather than risk physical confrontation. The younger Torino had never served in the military, viewing the idea of risking his life for strangers as the ultimate sucker's game. While Bobby was dodging bullets in Afghanistan, Frank was perfecting his intimidation techniques on Brooklyn shop owners, learning to read people's weaknesses and exploit their fears. His method was simple but effective. Demonstrate dominance through physical presence, create an atmosphere of unpredictability that kept victims off balance, and establish the family's authority through a combination of psychological pressure and occasional violence. Most importantly, target people who couldn't fight back, elderly shop owners, single mothers running small businesses, immigrants who feared deportation more than extortion. Frank drove a black Cadillac Escalade with tinted windows, wore expensive suits that emphasized his muscular build, and carried himself with the swagger of a man who had never faced serious consequences for his actions. His criminal record included several arrests for assault and extortion, but his family's connections and the neighborhood's code of silence had kept him out of serious prison time. What Frank didn't understand, what he had never been forced to learn, was the difference between fear and respect, between temporary compliance and genuine authority. He had spent 20 years terrorizing people who had no choice but to submit, never encountering someone with the training, experience, and backup to call his bluff. Bobby's daily routine had remained virtually unchanged for 15 years. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday morning, he would walk the 6 blocks from his apartment to Sal's Corner Deli, arriving precisely at 7:15 a.m. for what had become a cherished ritual of connection with his community. He always sat in the same corner booth, the one with red vinyl seats worn smooth by decades of use, positioned to provide an unobstructed view of the street while offering privacy for conversation. The booth's location wasn't accidental. His military training had made him unconsciously select the position that offered the best tactical advantages: clear sight lines, multiple escape routes, and the ability to observe potential threats before they entered his space. The morning routine served multiple purposes beyond simple caffeine consumption. It was Bobby's way of staying connected to the neighborhood he had grown up in and chosen to protect through his military service. It provided structure to his retirement days and offered opportunities for informal mentorship of younger community members who sought his advice on everything from career decisions to family problems. Sal Benedetto, the deli's 67-year-old owner, had known Bobby since childhood and always had his coffee ready before he reached the counter. 2 sugars, splash of cream, served in the same ceramic mug that had been Bobby's unofficial property for over a decade. Their morning conversation rarely varied. Brief updates on their families, commentary on the Yankees' latest performance, and gentle complaints about how the neighborhood was changing. This particular Tuesday morning had started like any other. Bobby had kissed Maria goodbye as she left for her job at the local elementary school, completed his daily calisthenics routine in their small bedroom, and dressed in his customary civilian uniform, pressed khaki pants, white button-down shirt, and the navy blue baseball cap embroidered with U.S. Army veteran that Maria had given him for his 70th birthday. The walk to Sal's had been pleasant and unremarkable. He had exchanged greetings with Mrs. Romano as she swept her front steps, waved to Officer Patterson during his morning patrol, and stopped briefly to admire the new flowers in the community garden that local volunteers had planted the previous weekend. At exactly 7:15 a.m., Bobby had entered Sal's Deli and claimed his usual booth, spreading the daily news on the red Formica table, and settling in for what he expected to be another peaceful morning of coffee, reading, and quiet observation of his community's daily rhythms. The deli's atmosphere had radiated its usual warmth and familiarity. 3 construction workers occupied a booth near the window, discussing their upcoming project while demolishing plates of eggs and bacon. 2 elderly women sat at the counter, gossiping about their grandchildren over coffee and Danish. A young mother with a toddler had claimed a corner table, keeping her son entertained with coloring books while she enjoyed a rare moment of peace. Bobby had ordered his usual breakfast coffee, wheat toast, and a side of fresh fruit, and was reading an article about veterans' health care reform when the deli's peaceful atmosphere began to shift in ways so subtle that only someone with his training would notice. What Frank Torino didn't know as he prepared to enter Sal's Deli was that Bobby Martinez wasn't just any random veteran. 23 years earlier, during Bobby's second deployment to Afghanistan, he had saved the life of a young Marine Corps lieutenant who had been trapped under enemy fire during a joint operation near the Pakistani border. That lieutenant was Anthony Tony Castellano Jr., the nephew of crime boss Vincent Vinny Castellano and the eldest son of the family's underboss. Tony had been serving his country with genuine honor and courage, trying to distance himself from his family's criminal enterprises by proving his worth through military service rather than intimidation and violence. The rescue had been a textbook example of Bobby's leadership and tactical expertise. When Tony's unit had been pinned down by Taliban fighters in a narrow valley, Bobby had led a small team through enemy territory, using his knowledge of mountain warfare to outflank the attackers and create an escape route. The operation had saved 6 Marines, including Tony, but had cost Bobby the shrapnel wounds that still ached in cold weather. Tony Castellano had never forgotten the debt he owed to the Army sergeant who had risked everything to bring him home alive. After completing his military service with distinction, Tony had returned to New York but had refused his family's attempts to draw him into their criminal operations. Instead, he had used his veterans' benefits to attend law school and was now working as a federal prosecutor specializing in organized crime cases. The irony was lost on Frank Torino, who had no idea that his upcoming victim was not only a decorated veteran, but also the man who had saved the life of his crime family's most prominent legitimate member. Frank's intelligence gathering was limited to identifying easy targets for extortion. He never bothered to research the personal histories of the people he intimidated. Bobby, for his part, had never learned the full name of the young Marine he had pulled from that Afghan valley. Military operations involved hundreds of personnel, and the chaos of combat often prevented the kind of personal connections that might have formed under different circumstances. He remembered the rescue clearly. It was a kind of mission that defined a soldier's career, but he had never connected that frightened young lieutenant with the Castellano family that controlled criminal operations in his neighborhood. The twist of fate was about to create a situation that neither man could have anticipated, where family loyalty and criminal intimidation would collide with military honor and federal law enforcement in ways that would reshape the entire neighborhood's power structure. Frank Torino pushed through the glass door of Sal's Corner Deli at exactly 8:30 a.m., his timing calculated to maximize the psychological impact of his presence. The morning rush had subsided, leaving behind the regulars who formed the neighborhood's social core, exactly the audience Frank wanted for his display of dominance. His entrance was deliberately theatrical, designed to announce his arrival and establish immediate control over the space. The door's bell chimed sharply as he let it slam shut behind him, the sound cutting through the deli's comfortable murmur of conversation like a warning shot. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as patrons instinctively recognized the change in atmosphere. Frank's physical presence filled the narrow deli like a storm cloud. His black leather jacket strained across shoulders that had been built through years of intimidation work rather than honest labor. Gold chains caught the fluorescent light, and his cologne, an expensive brand that he wore too heavily, competed with the deli's natural aromas of coffee and fresh bread. His dark eyes swept the deli with predatory calculation, cataloging potential witnesses and assessing the room's dynamics. The construction workers near the window looked down at their plates, unwilling to make eye contact. The elderly women at the counter suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating. Even the young mother gathered her toddler closer, sensing danger without understanding its source. Frank's gaze settled on Bobby Martinez's corner booth with the satisfaction of a hunter spotting perfect prey. The location offered everything Frank needed for conducting business: privacy for intimidation, visibility for public demonstration of his authority, and tactical advantages that he understood from years of collecting protection money. What Frank saw was an elderly man in civilian clothes, sitting alone and apparently defenseless, exactly the kind of target that had made his reputation as an effective enforcer. The military bearing that commanded respect from fellow veterans read, to Frank, as nothing more than an old man trying to maintain dignity in the face of inevitable defeat. The weathered hands that bore scars from combat looked to Frank like signs of weakness and age. The careful posture that reflected decades of military discipline appeared to be nothing more than an old man's attempt to look important while occupying space that could be better used by someone with real power. Frank had built his career on reading people's vulnerabilities and exploiting their fears. In Bobby Martinez, he saw what he believed to be the perfect combination of isolation and helplessness: an elderly man with no obvious protection, sitting in a public space where his humiliation would serve as a lesson to other potential resistance. The crime family's intelligence on local businesses had identified Sal's Deli as behind on their protection payments, and Frank's job was to remind the owner of his obligations while demonstrating the consequences of noncompliance. The elderly veteran in the corner booth represented an opportunity to accomplish both goals simultaneously. What Frank couldn't see, what his limited understanding of real strength prevented him from recognizing, was that he was about to confront a man who had faced down trained enemy combatants in actual war zones, who had earned the respect of fellow soldiers through demonstrated courage under fire, and whose military connections extended far beyond the neighborhood's boundaries. Frank approached Bobby's booth with the deliberate swagger of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. His footsteps echoed on the deli's tile floor, each one calculated to announce his presence and build psychological pressure. The few remaining customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the approaching confrontation, while hoping to remain invisible. "Hey, old man," Frank announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet deli with the harsh authority of someone who had never been challenged. "I need this booth for a business meeting. Time to move." Bobby looked up from his newspaper with the measured response of someone who had faced real threats in real combat situations. His expression remained calm but alert, taking in Frank's size, posture, and aggressive body language with a tactical assessment that had kept him alive through 2 tours of duty. The elderly veteran's eyes held none of the fear that Frank was accustomed to seeing in his victims. Instead, there was a quiet confidence that came from facing down enemy soldiers in rice paddies and urban firefights where the stakes were life and death rather than neighborhood dominance. "There are plenty of empty booths, son," Bobby replied quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed by men far more dangerous than a neighborhood bully. No need for trouble. The respectful but firm response caught Frank off guard. He was used to immediate compliance, stammered apologies, or cowering submission from his targets. Bobby's calm refusal to be intimidated represented a challenge to Frank's authority that he couldn't allow to stand unchallenged. "Trouble." Frank laughed, a harsh sound that made the waitress behind the counter flinch and caused the remaining customers to shift nervously in their seats. "Old man, you clearly don't understand how things work around here. When I ask for something, I get it. When I tell someone to move, they move." Frank leaned forward, placing both hands on the table in a gesture designed to invade Bobby's personal space and establish physical dominance. The move brought his face closer to the elderly veteran's, allowing Frank to use his size advantage to maximum psychological effect. "This booth has the best view of the street and the most privacy for conducting business," Frank continued, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that carried clearly in the now silent deli. "I've got important people coming here in 20 minutes, and they expect to find me sitting in the best seat in the house." Bobby studied the younger man's face with the clinical detachment of someone who had learned to read enemy intentions under extreme pressure. He recognized the signs of escalating aggression and understood that Frank was looking for confrontation rather than simply wanting a different seat. In Afghanistan, Bobby had learned to distinguish between situations that could be resolved through diplomacy and those where violence was inevitable. Frank's body language, tone of voice, and predatory focus suggested someone who had already decided that intimidation was the only language he understood. "I've been sitting in this booth for 15 years, Bobby replied with the same calm authority, taking another careful sip of his coffee while maintaining eye contact. "But if you really need this particular spot for legitimate business purposes, I suppose I could consider." "Consider." Frank's voice rose sharply, cutting through Bobby's diplomatic attempt at de-escalation. "You think this is a negotiation? You think you get to consider what I'm telling you to do?" The verbal assault attracted the attention of every person in the deli, transforming what had started as a private confrontation into a public test of wills. Frank had deliberately escalated the situation beyond the point where either man could back down without losing face. Bobby recognized the tactical error immediately. By making the confrontation public, Frank had eliminated the possibility of quiet resolution and created a situation where one of them would have to be definitively defeated in front of witnesses. The elderly veteran's military training kicked in automatically, his mind calculating possible responses while his body remained relaxed and non-threatening. Violence was always an option. His hands still remembered techniques for neutralizing threats efficiently and quietly. But at 81, he had access to resources that rendered physical confrontation unnecessary. "Son," Bobby said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience and the calm authority of someone who had commanded men in life-or-death situations. "I can see you're upset about something. But there's no need to make this into something bigger than it needs to be." The attempt at de-escalation only seemed to enrage Frank further. In his world, any resistance to his authority was a direct challenge that required overwhelming response. The old man's refusal to show proper fear and submission represented everything Frank hated about people who didn't understand their place in the neighborhood's power structure. "Upset," Frank snarled, his face reddening with anger and embarrassment at being lectured by someone he viewed as helpless prey. "You think I'm upset? Old man, you're about to learn what upset really looks like." What nobody in Sal's deli knew, including Frank himself, was that Vinny Castellano, the head of the crime family, was actually Bobby Martinez's former army medic from Afghanistan. 30 years ago, when Vinny was known as Vincent Castellanos, before dropping the S to sound more Italian, he had served under Staff Sergeant Martinez during the brutal Battle of Kandahar. It was Bobby who had carried the wounded young medic to safety during a Taliban ambush, saving his life and earning Vinny's eternal gratitude. After the war, Vinny had returned to Brooklyn, changed his name slightly, and built his criminal empire while always wondering what had happened to the sergeant who had saved his life. The cruel irony was devastating. Frank had just assaulted the one man in Brooklyn that his own boss considered untouchable, the war hero who had literally given Vinny his second chance at life. 22 minutes after Bobby's phone call, the distant rumble of diesel engines began penetrating the deli's walls. Detective Santos looked up from her paperwork, recognizing the distinctive sound of military vehicles moving in convoy formation. "That's not NYPD backup," she muttered, moving toward the window. Outside, 3 olive green Humvees pulled up in perfect tactical formation, their presence transforming the quiet Brooklyn street into something resembling a combat zone. Soldiers emerged with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated and purposeful despite being in a civilian environment. Captain Diego Martinez stepped out of the lead vehicle, his dress uniform crisp, and his expression carrying the cold fury of a son who had just learned his father had been attacked. At 6 feet 2 inches, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, his presence immediately dominated the scene. Frank, still handcuffed in the police cruiser, watched through the window as his simple morning collection turned into what looked like a military occupation. "What the hell is happening?" he stammered to the officer guarding him. "That," Detective Santos said grimly, "is what happens when you assault a decorated veteran whose son has connections throughout the military intelligence community." Captain Martinez entered Sal's deli with the measured stride of someone trained to take control of chaotic situations. His eyes immediately found his father, cataloging the red mark on his cheek and the coffee stains on his shirt with a clinical assessment of a soldier evaluating battlefield casualties. "Dad," he said simply, his voice carrying both deep concern and barely controlled rage. "Report on your condition." "Operational, son," Bobby replied, unconsciously slipping into military terminology. "Minor contact with hostile civilian. No lasting damage." The brief exchange demonstrated the unique bond between 2 generations of soldiers, communication that was simultaneously professional and deeply personal, efficient yet loaded with emotion. Detective Santos watched the reunion with growing understanding of just how significant this incident had become. This wasn't just a local assault case anymore. It was an attack on a military family that would reverberate through federal law enforcement and military command structures. "Captain Martinez," she said, introducing herself with professional courtesy. "Detective Santos, NYPD Organized Crime Task Force. Your father showed remarkable restraint and dignity throughout this incident. The perpetrator is in custody and facing multiple federal charges." At the same moment, 20 blocks away, in his social club, Vincent Vinny Castellano was reviewing the morning's collection reports when his lieutenant burst through the door with news that would shatter his world. "Boss, we got a problem," the man panted. "Frank got arrested at Sal's Deli, beat up some old veteran, and now the feds are involved." Vinny looked up with mild irritation. Frank's tendency toward unnecessary violence had always been a concern, but federal attention over one old man seemed excessive. "What's the veteran's name?" Vinny asked, more out of curiosity than concern. "Bobby Martinez. Army guy, lives in the neighborhood." The coffee cup slipped from Vinny's hands, shattering on the floor as 30 years of memories crashed back. The name he had never forgotten. The face that had appeared in his dreams for decades. The man who had crawled through enemy fire to drag him to safety. "Get me everything on this Martinez," Vinny whispered, his voice shaking. "Everything. And get Frank on the phone. Now." But it was too late. Frank's phone was in an evidence bag, and the man who had unknowingly assaulted his boss's savior was about to face consequences that went far beyond federal prosecution. Back at Sal's Deli, Captain Martinez was coordinating with federal agents who had arrived to support Detective Santos's investigation. The scene had transformed into a multi-agency operation that would become a case study in interagency cooperation. "Sir," his senior NCO reported quietly, "we've got confirmation that this incident is connected to ongoing federal investigations into organized crime activities. The perpetrator has been under surveillance for months." Bobby listened to the military coordination with pride and amazement. His simple phone call for backup had triggered a response that demonstrated the true meaning of military brotherhood. No veteran stands alone, regardless of age or circumstances. Frank, watching from the police cruiser as more federal agents arrived, finally began to understand the magnitude of his error. This wasn't just about slapping an old man anymore. This was about attacking someone who was connected to people with real power, the kind of power that could destroy entire criminal organizations. The 22 minutes from Bobby's phone call to his son's arrival would become legendary in both military and law enforcement circles. A perfect example of how quickly America's protectors rallied to defend one of their own. Captain Martinez approached the police cruiser where Frank sat handcuffed, his dress uniform commanding immediate respect from every federal agent and police officer on scene. The contrast between military discipline and street criminal arrogance could not have been more stark. "Mr. Torino," Captain Martinez said, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had commanded men in life-and-death situations, "you assaulted a decorated combat veteran who served his country with honor. That veteran is my father." Frank's face went pale as he fully grasped the scope of his error. This wasn't just about federal charges anymore. This was personal for someone with the power to make his life permanently miserable. "Look, I didn't know he was your father," Frank stammered, desperation creeping into his voice. "If I'd known he was connected to military people, I never would have." "The problem," Captain Martinez interrupted, "isn't that you didn't know who he was. The problem is that you thought it was acceptable to assault any elderly person." As federal agents prepared to transport Frank to detention, he made a desperate phone call to his lawyer using his one permitted call. But instead of reaching his attorney, he accidentally dialed his estranged sister Maria, a woman he hadn't spoken to in 15 years. "Frankie," came the surprised voice. "Why are you calling from jail?" "Maria, I need help. I'm in serious trouble," Frank pleaded. "What did you do now?" she asked wearily. "I hit an old veteran at a deli. Now the whole military is after me." There was a long pause before Maria's voice returned, heavy with disappointment and irony. "Frankie, I'm a nurse at the VA hospital. I spend every day taking care of veterans who sacrificed everything for this country. How could you do something so horrible?" Frank's world collapsed as he realized that even his own family would be ashamed of his actions. The sister he had abandoned years ago was dedicating her life to caring for the very people he had chosen to victimize. The simple twist revealed that Frank's path of violence and intimidation had not only destroyed his relationship with his community and law enforcement, it had cost him his family's respect as well. As Frank was transported to federal detention, The full weight of his actions began to settle over everyone involved. What had started as a routine morning at a neighborhood deli had become a defining moment for an entire community. Bobby Martinez sat quietly in his corner booth, finally finishing his coffee while surrounded by the organized chaos of a major federal investigation. His quiet dignity throughout the ordeal had transformed him from victim to symbol of the values that still mattered in America. The 22 minutes from his phone call to his son's arrival would become legendary proof that no veteran truly stands alone. Vincent "Vinny" Castellano burst through the doors of the Federal Detention Center with the desperation of a man trying to undo the greatest mistake of his organization's history. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from the frantic drive across Brooklyn. "I need to see Frank Torino immediately," he demanded at the reception desk, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation and influence. The federal marshal behind the bulletproof glass looked up with practiced indifference. "Visiting hours are—" "You don't understand," Vinny interrupted, pulling out his phone to show a photograph he had treasured for 30 years, a faded picture of his army unit in Afghanistan, with a young medic standing next to Staff Sergeant Bobby Martinez. "The man my employee assaulted saved my life in combat. This is a terrible mistake that needs to be corrected immediately." The marshal studied the photograph, then Vinny's face, recognizing the genuine anguish of a man confronting an impossible situation. But federal law was federal law, regardless of personal histories or criminal connections. "Sir, Mr. Torino is being held on federal charges. No exceptions for visiting hours, and certainly no exceptions for organized crime figures, regardless of their military service." Back at Sal's Corner Deli, something remarkable was happening. Word of Bobby's assault and the federal investigation had spread throughout Bensonhurst, and residents were arriving in unprecedented numbers to show their support for the elderly veteran and provide testimony against the Castellano family's intimidation tactics. Mrs. Romano arrived with a casserole and tears in her eyes. "Bobby Martinez helped my family through the worst time of our lives," she told Detective Santos. "When my husband had his heart attack, Bobby drove me to the hospital every day for 3 months and never asked for anything in return." Officer Patterson was documenting testimonies from dozens of business owners who had been victims of the family's protection racket. "Detective, we've got statements implicating at least 15 different members of the organization," he reported. "This assault opened floodgates we never expected." The young mother who had been in the deli during the assault approached Bobby's table with her toddler. "Sir, I want my son to meet a real hero," she said simply. "This is what courage looks like." Bobby smiled and shook the child's small hand with gentle dignity. "Young man, real heroes are the people who stand up for others every day. Teachers, nurses, police officers, firefighters. I was just doing my job." FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh arrived to coordinate the expanded investigation, bringing with her a team of federal prosecutors who had been building RICO cases against organized crime families for years. Bobby's assault had provided the final piece of evidence they needed to move forward with comprehensive indictments. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Agent Walsh, said, "Your courage in standing up to these criminals has given us the opportunity to protect hundreds of other potential victims. This investigation will extend far beyond today's incident." The federal response was swift and overwhelming. Search warrants were executed simultaneously at 12 locations associated with the Castellano family. Assets were frozen, electronic communications were intercepted, and decades of criminal activity were finally being exposed to legal scrutiny. Frank's simple act of violence had triggered the largest federal operation against organized crime in Brooklyn's recent history, demonstrating that in America, even the most powerful criminals were not above the law when they targeted those who had served their country. As federal agents finished processing the scene at Sal's Deli, Captain Diego Martinez approached his father with an envelope that had been delivered to Fort Hamilton earlier that morning, before the assault had even occurred. The timing was impossible, yet undeniable. "Dad, this arrived for you at the base this morning," Diego said, his voice carrying confusion and wonder. It's from someone named Vincent Castellanos, but the return address shows it was mailed 3 days ago. Bobby's weathered hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter on expensive stationery, accompanied by a faded photograph. The same Army unit picture that Vinny had shown the federal marshal, but this copy was pristine, carefully preserved for 3 decades. Dear Staff Sergeant Martinez, the letter began, I don't know if you remember me, Vincent Castellanos, your medic from the 10th Mountain Division. For 30 years, I've been trying to find you to say the words I never got to say in that Afghan hospital. Thank you for saving my life. Bobby's eyes widened as memories flooded back. A young, scared medic who had been trapped under enemy fire. The desperate rescue mission, carrying the wounded soldier to safety while bullets whistled overhead. The letter continued, I've built a life in Brooklyn, but not the life you would be proud of. Every day, I've dishonored the second chance you gave me. I've been searching for you to make amends and ask for your forgiveness. I heard through veteran networks that you live in Bensonhurst. I'm planning to visit Sal's Deli on Tuesday morning to finally meet you properly and apologize for the man I became. By the time you read this, I'll be there. At that exact moment, Vinny Castellano was sitting in his car outside the Federal Detention Center, his head in his hands, realizing that his letter would arrive too late. He had planned to meet Bobby that morning to confess his crimes and ask for forgiveness, but Frank's assault had made redemption impossible. The man he had spent 30 years trying to find had been assaulted by his own organization, while Vinny was writing a letter begging for forgiveness. The irony was devastating and complete. Dad, Diego said softly, there's more. Bobby continued reading. I know what I am, Sergeant. I know you saved a life that became something shameful. But if you're willing to meet me, I want to surrender myself to federal authorities and provide testimony against every criminal I've ever worked with. It's the only way I can honor the sacrifice you made for me. You saved my body in Afghanistan. Maybe you can help me save my soul in Brooklyn. 3 hours later, Vincent Castellano walked into the FBI field office and surrendered himself, carrying Bobby's letter and 30 years of evidence against organized crime operations throughout Brooklyn. His testimony would eventually dismantle 6 different criminal families and put dozens of criminals behind bars. Frank Torino was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, but his assault on Bobby had inadvertently triggered the largest organized crime prosecution in New York's history. The neighborhood bully had unknowingly destroyed the very organization he thought protected him. Bobby Martinez was awarded the FBI's Civilian Service Award and invited to speak at military academies about the values of service and sacrifice. But he preferred to spend his mornings at Sal's Corner Deli, where a small plaque now marked the veterans' table. The booth where an elderly veteran had been assaulted became a symbol of dignity, courage, and the truth that in America, justice may be delayed, but it is never denied. 22 minutes had changed everything. Military brotherhood had prevailed. And Bobby Martinez had unknowingly saved the same life twice, once with his courage and once with his forgiveness. This incredible story shows us that justice and redemption can happen in the most unexpected ways. If this moved you like it moved me, smash that subscribe button for more amazing true stories of justice and military brotherhood. What do you think about Vinny's attempt to make amends? Share your thoughts in the comments below.